Okay, thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to Neuroscience Grand Rounds. We are fortunate to have Dr. Dwayne Compton to help expand our awareness of diversity. And maybe after today, we'll have an understanding of what it means to be culturally responsive. I hope so. Dr. Compton is serving as Associate Dean for Community Engagement and Diversity and is our Chief Diversity Officer at the School of Medicine. He's also on research faculty at U of L. He obtained his master's in education from U of L in 2007 and his doctorate degree in education in 2016 from Spalding University. He's on the board of directors of many organizations in Louisville Metro Department of Public Health and Wellness, Park Duval Community Center, Health Center, YMCA of Greater Louisville, and many others. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Compton speaking with us today about striving for a diverse workforce and dealing with systemic racism. Thank you, yes. Dr. Compton.
No, thank you all for having me this morning. So good morning to everyone. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all this morning and to share, a lot of what I've been able to share with our colleagues across the School of Medicine, across the university, and even within the local community. So this is something that, yes, I do for School of Medicine, but I'm also out in the community sharing a lot of these same things because the goal is for us to come together collectively and create and truly create that diverse, inclusive, and equitable community, School of Medicine, healthcare, and so on and so forth that we say we want. So I try to make sure I take this message that I'm sharing with you all this morning into other spaces, just so we can have some critical conversations about it and find common ground. I always say we won't agree on everything. But I think through conversation, we'll find some common ground in ways that we probably never thought. But I will say congratulations to you and thank you for being bold enough to take this step. There are some departments across the university that don't even want to tackle this topic, right? Because it may cause uneasy feelings and things of that nature, as opposed to, as Dr. Rimble indicated, expanding the thought process around these particular topics and to really look at what the School of Medicine is trying to do in moving forward with not only our strategic plan, but creating an environment that is welcoming, inclusive, supportive, respectful of any individual, regardless to any identity characteristic that they maintain. I mean, we want people to really bring their authentic self into the spaces throughout the School of Medicine and even within our healthcare system. And unfortunately, that's not the case for some. Some do have to shield and hide parts of who they are in fear of discrimination, outright racism in some instances, and so on. So I am going to begin to share my screen. Please let me know when it comes up, and we'll proceed with the presentation. Can you all see this?
No, not yet.
No. Okay, let me get my initial test.
Is there anything I can do to help you, Dr. Compton?
I believe I have it now. I had to close out my PowerPoint and then open it back up. So it should be showing up now. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can see it now.
All right, good deal. So as Dr. Rimmel indicated, the title of today's talk is Striving for a Diverse Workforce and Dealing with Systemic Racism as a Physician and or Researcher. The CME Code is there for you all. I do have it in other parts of the presentation That way, if you miss it on this slide, you'll be able to see it again. I have no disclosures to report. Submitted all the paperwork for that. And then, of course, it's been indicated, my titles here at the university. One of the things I feel like we're really great about is acknowledging titles of folks across the School of Medicine, across our institution. I think our society has a, this thing with titles, right? And titles give you power in a lot of different instances. But I always like to break it down. And yes, I'm the Associate Dean for Community Engagement and Diversity. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer. I'm an Assistant Professor. But, I also like to acknowledge that I identify as a Black male. I am a husband and father of 3 beautiful daughters, a son, brother, I identify as Christian. So there are other identities that I carry with me beyond the titles. I'm a Louisville native. I was raised right here in Louisville, Kentucky, in West Louisville, to be exact, and graduated from Shawnee High School. I come from a low socioeconomic family, and I also was a first-generation college student, and really the first in my family, and the only in my family, to have a bachelor's degree or higher. And so there was a former student athlete, so I did play college basketball as well as coach college basketball. And so I always like to make that known on the very front end, because it's great to know titles, and with each of us here assembled today, we have titles, but we also have other identity characteristics that we bring with us into spaces, whether they're known or not. There are things that play into our decision making, whether we realize it or not, right? It plays into our thinking. So today's session overview is to develop an understanding of what it means to be culturally responsive, engage in some dialogue. I do have some questions that in the later part of the presentation that I will ask folks to respond to, if willing. It talks about the importance of dealing with systemic racism, and then learn about some resources available to assist with creating an inclusive workforce. I always like to do session norms. It is really important to understand that, to listen respectfully and actively, listen with an open mind to understand another point of view. I recognize that in this day and time, people are somewhat exhausted about talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I always say it is important to listen respectfully and actively, and not be closed-minded to it, because we can all learn something new. I learn something new all the time with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I serve as the Chief Diversity Officer. So commit to learning and not debating. The stories that people may share stay, but take the lesson with you. Oftentimes when I do presentations, somebody will share that make themselves a little vulnerable, and they'll share an experience or something that maybe they saw, heard, etc. So we want those stories to stay here within this group, but then take the lesson away. Share the space. Sometimes we do have folks that like to hog the air, as we say. Allow everybody to speak and have their opinions and voices heard. And then avoid assumptions about your colleagues. It is important that we all check our biases. I always like to cover the University of Louisville vision statement. I recognize that in onboarding, whether it's through the university, HR, or through our own School of Medicine onboarding, or even U of L Health and other entities, we don't often look at the mission statement, diversity vision statement, et cetera. So I'm providing it here and highlighted the part that I feel is most important. We say that we strive to foster and sustain an environment of inclusiveness that empowers us all to achieve our highest potential without fear of prejudice or bias. And I know we say that, we strive for that, we make commitments to that, but sadly, that's not always the case. As a Chief Diversity Officer, I can say that, I get emails and calls regularly about instances of prejudice, bias, discrimination, and just in some cases, outright racism. And it really does negatively impact our environment. It impacts our ability to recruit and retain great faculty, researchers, staff, students, trainees, etc. So there is an impact to that, but I always like to share this because some folks have never seen it. So let's talk about what diversity is, right? It's a range of attributes that, we all have diversity. We're all a puzzle piece. We all have these identity characteristics that range from our race, our ethnicity, gender identity, so on and so forth. And sometimes I think we forget about that because we focus on certain ones that we have to check the box on. But the reality is diversity is vast, right? It's important to understand that multiculturalism and diversity includes more than just your race, your gender, religion, and socioeconomic status. There are a lot of different cultural groups um, and identity pieces that you'll see in that puzzle piece there, and we all probably can connect in some shape, form, or fashion to each one of those. Equity, is a focus on equitable opportunities, treatment, and access to resources. So, do everyone in your department, division, center, or what have you have equitable opportunity and access, right? Are they treated equitably? Are some people, there just because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, etc.? Do everybody have access to the professional development funds? Do everybody have access to the number of resources that your department may offer? These are things that we look at when we're talking about equity, right? The process of removing systemic barriers to create equality for everyone. And we have to keep that in mind because one of the things that I do as a chief diversity officer is I encourage folks across the School of Medicine to look at their policies, practices, and procedures to ensure that they're equitable. If we have new faculty members, are new faculty members aware of the different opportunities? Are the senior faculty members are the only ones taking advantage of all of the resources that's available, right? The professional development funds and things like that, research dollars, different funds that may help advance the cause that you're working on. So what is inclusion? Creating and sustaining an environment where people from various backgrounds, again, feel welcome, valued, treated with respect, regardless of any identity characteristics that they maintain. Do they really feel included and supported and integrated, most importantly, integrated into all activities and operations within your department? Are they given equal access? And then are they able to contribute their ideas and concerns? Oftentimes, I feel like we have a tendency as a university sometimes to ask people about their opinions, but then we put limits on what they can contribute, right? Or how they can contribute. So we have to ensure that we not only have diversity, but we have equity, and then most importantly, that we have inclusion, that people's voices are heard, and that they feel like they can speak up and disagree, right, with something that may be happening in the department and not feel like they're going to be retaliated against, right? So that's a part of contributing your ideas, concerns, etc. I always like to utilize this slide from Verna Myers. She's somebody you should follow. She has great TED Talks, but she talks about diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, right? Sometimes we have a tendency to want diversity. We want to have that from a demographic perspective, from a thought perspective, but then not everybody is treated equitably. And they're not allowed to dance, as she says. I love that slide. I use it quite a bit. So what does it mean for us as a school or us individually to be culturally responsive? So I've over the years, I used to talk about cultural competence, right? That was the buzzword. We used it a lot across the School of Medicine, particularly with our UME students. We use it a lot. Cultural competence. You need to be culturally competent. You're going to serve a diverse patient population, et cetera. But I slowly started to move away from this cultural competence because it's hard to be competent about every culture, tradition, ethnicity, and community that's even in our Louisville community, but let alone across the United States, domestically and internationally. So I encourage people to be culturally responsive, be aware, right? And to do that, you have to start with self. You have to be aware of your own cultural identity. A lot of people, when asked, it takes them a while to think about what their cultural identities are, right? But it's important to be self-aware. Understand your views, assumptions, and biases about cultural identities different from your own. We'll talk about that a little bit here, a little more expanded in just a second, but I think that's even more important. Sometimes we fail to stop and view our own assumptions and biases about different cultural groups that's different from us, right? And that leads to problems down the road. It leads to problems in the workforce as well as in the learning environment. And then also to be culturally responsive, it means to have a desire and commit to expanding your knowledge about cultural identities of the individuals you work with, patients you serve, the community members that you engage with. And that self-education is important. And you're going to hear me say this time and time again, that self-education, meaning that you take it upon yourself to educate yourself about the different cultures around you, right? One of the things that I often say about Louisville that most people don't know is we're in the top 5 most segregated cities in the United States. And a lot of that is by race and socioeconomic status. And very seldom do people go to the community that I grew up in. Very seldom do they go to West Louisville and understand what's happening in West Louisville, or even South Louisville, where you have a lot of diversity in terms of cultures and traditions celebrated in South Louisville, and on throughout the county. But it's important that we commit to that self-education. So what are some barriers to achieving cultural responsiveness? A lot of it is our own implicit biases, right? These are the attitude and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Sometimes our implicit biases can be favorable, but in most cases we find that they're unfavorable and they're activated involuntarily. Sometimes we don't even realize we may have a bias towards a group of people or an individual until something happens that creates conflict, right? But we have to be aware of our biases. We have to examine those biases. And the reality is we all have biases. The goal is to understand our biases so they don't have a negative impact on individuals that we deal with. And I think that is the most important step, right? First step is acknowledging that we all have them. Even as a person that do diversity, equity, inclusion, I have to consistently remind myself of my biases so that they don't have a negative impact on the students, faculty, staff, trainees, and other internal and external stakeholders I interact with. So we have to be aware of those things. All right, additional barriers and some facts about our implicit biases. They're pervasive. We all possess them. Now, sometimes our biases don't always align with what we say, right? Sometimes we'll say, I don't have a bias toward that group, but you actually really do in many cases. And I'll give you an example. If any of you all have ever done the Harvard Project Implicit test, they have several from race to LGBTQ to religion to weight. I've done these implicit bias tests. They're free. And it showed that I hold a bias towards members of the LGBTQ community. So I had to stop for a second and think about why that might be, right? So that did not align with my declared belief or what I feel, but for some reason, when I did that test, it showed that I had a bias. So I had to sit with that. And I understand it. As I told you all about one of my identity characteristics being a Christian and someone who goes to church. The church doesn't always support that. And these little mind bugs are planted there, right? So I had to think back to where that might be. And for me, I can see that happens in the church, and I work hard to make sure that I support my declared beliefs, that I support anybody regardless to their sexual orientation, identity, and etc. We do generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, and there's a lot of research to show that. And we can even look at our practices, our policies, and how we recruit individuals across the board. Oftentimes, we tend to actually favor people to look like us. So we're looking for people who quote unquote fit, right? I hear that a whole lot. Well, we don't know that they will fit in here, right? Some departments, they do a really great job of getting beyond that. But there are some departments within School of Medicine. When you look at the department, it's very obvious that there's a favoritism towards individuals in their own identity groups. And then understand that, our implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are, and you all understand this, are incredibly complex. And so we can unlearn, right? We can unlearn these biases, but it takes hard work. There's a gentleman named Anthony Brown is doing some work around debiasing your brain, right? So there are individuals out there doing research, working to help people unlearn these implicit biases that they have. So where do they come from? So, one of the things we have to stop and think about is how do we first become socialized? Where do these biases come from, right? When we're born, when you go to the NICU or labor and delivery, you'll see little boys swaddled in blue blankets. You'll see little girls swaddled in pink blankets, right? We start that process of association with color when a person is born, right? So we have these mind bugs that we receive when we're born, as we are first socialized by our families, right? We spend a lot of time in our communities, within the schools, church, things of that nature. We get these mind bugs from TV, media, even as we listen to music, right? There are some things that's said in music that we might not pick up on right away, but over time has an impact, right? It creates unconscious, this unconscious thinking that either enforces or enforces biases or stigmatize certain groups, right? And then there are your own personal experiences. But nonetheless, I like to show this slide of Bobby Harrow's cycle of socialization, because oftentimes we don't stop to think about, how we were socialized within our families and communities that we grew up in, even within our work environments and what the work environment and learning environment communicates. But once we become aware of these things, we do have several decisions that we can make. We can either go with the status quo, promote the status quo and do nothing, or we can be disruptors. I like to say disruptors, be change agents, and we can do something when we see things or hear things that may happen, or even take a stand and question, question the status quo. We have to do more of that. Again, consequences of implicit biases end up in the isms, right? So these are the big 8 kind of identity groups. And oftentimes we'll hear about racism, we'll hear about ableism, we'll hear about ageism, sexism, classism. These are the things that often gets us in trouble within our work environments, within our communities, as well as our learning environments. So, we, instead of embracing diversity and really ensuring that everybody has that voice, it can be their authentic selves, our implicit biases lead us to these isms, and it leads us to a number of different closed doors conversations that we had to have, and sometimes in termination of a job, or maybe someone exiting from school. So, in an effort to make sure that everybody understands that biases lead to those isms that we all say we don't want in our work, learning, and research environments, we have to understand them. They exist, and when we don't acknowledge our biases, that's exactly what happens. That's the result. Another result, and I'm not sure how many of you all have heard of stereotype threat. Claude Steele and Josh Aronson coined this term in 1996. It refers to being at risk of confirming as a self-characteristic a negative stereotype about one social group, right? So you often will hear, at least for myself growing up, that, oh, well, black males don't really care about going to college, right? So if you're a young black male and you hear that time and time again, right, it creates that stereotype that where you believe maybe college isn't for me. There is a reason why there has been over a 45-year decline in black men, particularly applying to medical school. The AAMC has done a white paper on it, right? And a lot of it is because of stereotype threat. One, you can't be what you don't see. But the other part is when you're consistently told black men ain't trying to go to med school, that's the result, right? That's one example. We'll often hear about how women aren't good at math or not good at science. They need to just write. They're too emotional. They're this. People start to buy into it. I mean, I have 3 daughters, as I indicated, the 11 and 12-year-old, my oldest is 21, but the 11 and 12-year-old, both of them hate math and science. And when I ask them about, and we have dialogue about it, it's because they consistently hear that girls aren't good at math and science. And I usually say, no, that is not true. You're actually really great at it. And I try to do my part in ensuring that I offset that. But stereotype threat is real. We often see this when it comes to the MCAT exam, right? In certain populations, not being able to pass standardized tests because of different factors that's related to their one of their identities or their social group. We hear that a lot. I talked to a student yesterday who is rethinking applying to med school because of a stereotype threat. And I had to say, no, you know what? I'm not going to allow you to stop pursuing your dream because you think you can't get past the MCAT exam, right? But it's a true situation that we have to deal with, and it's not even just related to our students. We have colleagues that experience stereotype threat as well. And then, of course, here's some of those consequences: decreased performance in academic and non-academic settings, increased use of self-defeating behaviors, disengagement altogether, and then most importantly, alter professional aspirations. So I love the work that Steele and Aronson has done. They've updated that work. Of course, like I said, this was 1996. It's 2021. They have updated work that continues to support the notion that stereotype threat is real for a number of different social identity groups, largely those that are underrepresented and marginalized. Consequences of implicit bias also ends up with microaggressions, right? So Dr. Chester Pierce, who's a physician, a Black physician, coined this term in 1970 because he noticed, just through observations, he noticed that there were a lot of subtle verbal and nonverbal slights, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages directed towards an individual due to their identity group, often automatically and unconsciously. And so they're usually committed by well-intended folks who are unaware of the hitting messages that's being communicated. And we have to make sure that we're aware of that. So when you think about microaggressions, they kind of have they have several different categories, but the three that I have listed here: micro insults are often those unconscious verbal and nonverbal and environmental communications that subtly convey rudeness or insensitivity that demean a person's heritage or identity. I get a lot of emails and just have a lot of conversations about the micro insults because of our environment, when our physical environment within the School of Medicine. When people look at the pictures on the walls, things that we display, it doesn't communicate diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, it really supports this notion that white men, particularly within healthcare and science research, dominate, that environment. And so we support that notion by continuing to perpetuate it with photos and images and things of that nature versus celebrating all the folks that we have across our School of Medicine and within our health system. Of course, you have micro assaults, which are those conscious and very intentional discriminatory actions on one's identity, right? So, in the past, a person flying a Confederate flag or really denying a person from dating somebody of the same sex or somebody from a different race or ethnicity, right? Little things that denigrate women, blowing, whistling at women, refusing to provide services to people because of their race, right? Those are very intentional and things that we know that are assaults, but they're also microaggressions because they happen more often than we care to admit. And then you have those micro invalidations, those communications that subtly exclude, negate, and nullify the thoughts and feelings and experiences of a person's identity. We see this all too often, particularly in our learning spaces. And of course, I hear about it and work with colleagues to try to address these issues. Daryl Wayne Sue, who took Chester Pierce's work and expanded it, said that microaggressions are similar to carbon monoxide. It's invisible, but potentially lethal, right? They could be sort of a death by 1,000 cuts to the person that's on the receiving end. And I can say that regardless to my titles, regardless to, anything that I've accomplished in my life, I still receive a lot of microaggressions that I think well-intended people don't even realize, right? So I know this is true for many folks across our school and within our community. People just continue to ask the question, hey, to somebody who either is visually or identifies as Latinx or Hispanic, that, oh, you don't speak English, and I Spanish, and I've heard it. I've heard people say, oh, you don't speak Spanish, or you don't speak this language, and you're talking to American-born individuals who have only spoken English their whole life, but because they identify as Hispanic or Latinx, then people expect for them to know Spanish, right? Or somebody who's American born and identifies Asian, Indian, et cetera. No. Where are you really from, right? As as if no, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky is not an adequate answer. We see this often. It hurts my heart, to know that we still have this even in 2021. And then the middle one is really important. The limited representation of my race in your classroom and for you all in your labs and things of that nature does not make me the voice of all Black people. That can be tied to any identity characteristic, right? As a Black male, I can speak for Dwayne Compton. I can speak for my experiences. They very well may overlap with other race and other Black men's experiences, but then there are going to be some differences. I grew up in an urban metropolitan area. My experience as a Black male may be different from somebody that grew up in another country that identifies as a Black male, or somebody that grew up in a rural environment, right, or more suburban environment. So we have to keep these things in mind when we're engaging in conversation to make sure we're not committing those microaggressions. Of course, these things also lead to racial battle fatigue, and we're seeing a lot of this here lately because people are tired. When you think about the social unrest that we're seeing in our country, it's because people are really literally sick and tired and fatigued by having to always deal with racism, discrimination, and things of that nature. So William Smith coined this term in 2003. It's the psychosocial stress responses from being a racially oppressed group member in a society and, having to deal in many cases on a historically white campus, right? We have to acknowledge here at U of L, I know we're striving to be an anti-racist campus, but the reality is we're still a PWI. We're still a predominantly white campus, predominantly white institution. And so many of our departments reflect that, right? And if you're a person of color, you're always having to fight microaggressions and bias and things of the nature. It leads to high blood pressure, anxiety, stress, frustration, and things of the nature. And that's why we see a revolving door of individuals leaving. Oftentimes we make excuses when our Black, our other racial marginalized, like minoritized groups across the School of Medicine, when they leave, they left for a better job. No, most of the times they left because they were tired of being, on the receiving end of microaggressions and bias and discrimination, and that the fatigue is set in. They may not say that because they need recommendations and things of that nature, but the reality is that's usually the case. They will only share it with a few individuals that they trust who also may have similar experiences. So when we think about the consequences of implicit bias, it start out as stereotypes and unconscious bias ends up in us judging people. Our behavior, both in-person, verbal and nonverbal behavior starts to impact people, and the result is discrimination. If you've never heard about Catalyst, they have a great website that talks about how you can, correct your biases, right? But it starts with education. It starts with learning. One of the things that I love about Catalyst that they do is they talk about gender, and they talk about why is it that when our use of language and how we describe men in certain roles and how we describe women in certain roles, right? Who gets labeled as somebody who's assertive versus non-assertive? Who gets labeled with more positive terms versus negative terms? And believe it or not, there are a number of research studies that associate terminology and language with whether it's a racial group or even gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, etc. So this website is really, really good. But the ultimate goal is to recognize these things so that we don't have discrimination in our environment. So when we talk about racism, we tend to kind of put them into three different buckets. That interpersonal racism, right? A person can take their misinformation, stereotypes out. They can take that out on another group. And then, of course, it results in harassment, exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, hate, and or just outright violence, right, that they commit from a personal standpoint. Then we have institutional racism, which is looking at the policies, practices, procedures that are systemically embedded into normal practice within, our society and our organizations that lead to disparate treatment and discrimination of certain populations and the people. As the chief diversity officer, this is something that I deal with quite a bit across our school. In fact, across our university. I failed to mention that I serve on the Commission on Diversity and Racial Equality, which is an advisory group to the president. And we often have to report to her the different forms of institutional racism that exist, and they do follow along policies, practices, and procedures. So we have to all collectively work to reduce that and eliminate it. And then you have that structural racism, which is a cumulative impact of the interpersonal and institutional racism that exists. So these are things that we know happen. The impact, we see it. We can see it within our healthcare system. We can see it within our research communities. We can see it within our educational systems. We see it within the federal government, government at all levels. We see it in media. We think about access to funds, right, within our banking and just economically. Who gets access to money and who doesn't? We see it in the church, and then so on and so forth, the legal system. So systemic racism, institutional racism, and structural racism, unfortunately, is woven into the fabric of a lot of our systems. Now, the reality is a lot of people don't want to recognize that, but it is there. There's a lot of data that supports it, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. There is a group called LSERS, Louisville Standing Up for Racial Justice. It is a group here in the city. It's a national group. Standing Up for Racial Justice is a national group, but we have a chapter here in Louisville that helps educate our white colleagues here in the city about this structural racism and how to stand up and act against racism in all forms. So here are some questions that I do want to pose when we think about racism. One, what are some examples of interpersonal racism that you have seen personally or heard at work, in the learning environment? And then what harm do you feel is caused? Let's start with that first question. And feel free to, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second so that we can get back to the main screen. Okay, there we go. So that first question being, what are some examples of interpersonal racism that you may have seen or heard in your work, research spaces, and things of that nature? Anybody willing to share? Okay. So I'll go to the next questions. What are some examples of institutional racism that you may have seen within our institution, whether it's in the learning environment or clinical environment? How does it benefit the majority group? How does it harm groups that are minoritized?
Hey, this is Joseph Niemann. I don't know if you can hear me at the back of this large room here.
Yes.
I do think there can be, I don't know if it's a racial bias or a cultural bias, sometimes the way we treat patients. So many people who, have infections from drug use and this sort of thing, and there becomes a bias that people from a certain class or certain group of community, I think are treated differently. We have a bias as we walk in the room, that we expect that there's going to be, drug use or what have you. And so I think that does influence the way that we treat people and the way that we respond to their pain, to their care. And I think that's something that we have to constantly work against, constantly sort of make.
I agree. And thank you for that, Dr. Niemann. Because that is a reality that particularly as patients come into many of our hospitals, they get confronted with that type of bias or racism right off, right? And we see it in emergency rooms, especially. And I've heard of not just our faculty, our physicians, medical students, and trainees, but other frontline people in the hospital system say things that denigrating based off of just their bias and their understanding from a race standpoint, right? Referring to people as ghetto, as drug addicts, and and stereotyping a certain group, as you indicated. We see that quite a bit. We've seen people have to change the look, their identity, their physical appearance, a mode that's expected of them, right? So I know a lot of black women that wear their hair very natural, or black folks that wear dreadlocks, and they've been told that they can't do that and that they needed to cut their hair or wear their hair a certain way, right? That's outright racist to me, right? That's not even discriminatory. To tell somebody that their identity is not acceptable because somebody else's discriminatory or racist thoughts towards that is unacceptable. But it happens quite a bit, and when it happens, word travels really fast. So those are things that I know that have happened, things that I've had to deal with. I've heard of instances where people were referred to as baby mamas, right? Some stuff that people see and hear on TV or in music, etc. And then somebody in our professional environment refers to our clientele that we deal with in that manner. And we've had that happen, right? Where did that come from? And why did you choose to say that this person is quote unquote a baby mama versus someone who is of the same race, right? We've seen that being referred to certain populations of individuals as well. So we again, it's something that happens. And I know these are topics that people don't always like to speak up on and talk about, but I put those probing questions there because I think it's important for you all's departments to really have these discussions, ongoing discussions about race and racism, even if they're in smaller groups and not in this type of setting. But then I also had a third question up there. What can be done individually or collectively to mitigate various forms of racism and bias that you all see in your departments? What are some ways that you all can tackle that and mitigate it?
We have to make it open. We have to make it easy for people to communicate with each other and feel comfortable. We have to have settings where it is acceptable to bring it out in the open and talk about it.
Yes, definitely. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be acknowledged. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it needs to be a constant conversation. I think over the last year, we've gotten better at this by acknowledging that this is important. Not that we have, rooted out the problems, but at least we're more comfortable having these conversations, more comfortable engaging and being open to learning.
Yes.
I think that's critically important, and I think that's a process that has to be perpetual. That we're not going to solve this in a month or a year, or it's going to be an ongoing effort that we maintain.
Exactly. So it took us years, decades, centuries to get here, right? So it's not going to be an overnight thing, but we all can individually and collectively do our part in supporting individuals that we know are on the receiving end of discrimination, bias, and hate. One of the things that I often see is that when somebody does speak up, then people distance themselves, their colleagues and peers distance themselves from them. And that's one of the things I want to make sure that I communicate is, to not distance yourself from somebody who is speaking up and speaking out about issues, because then we're saying, okay, well, you're problematic because you're bringing this up. And it does happen. It happens among our trainees. I'm dealing with some cases right now where people feel like they're targeted because nobody wants to associate with them now because they brought up an issue that was racist in nature, and there's enough evidence to support it. And now they're like, oh, well, I'm just trying to get through my program, and I don't want to rock the boat, so I'm going to promote the status quo and stay over in my lane and not acknowledge it. So we do have to make sure that we support one another and call things out when we see it and do our best to mitigate those things. All right, so I'll start to share my screen again, and we'll. have some additional questions, and I will actually, this is something that I would like to share uh, and have you all to discuss in smaller groups and just, thinking about misperceptions, negative misperceptions and biases that people have about identity groups that you maintain. I think it is important that, as I said before, we all have different identity groups and things are said negatively about those groups. And so I think this is great for small group conversation, to explain to people what is great about your identity group, um, what do you want people to do or never say again as it relates to that identity group? We have to have that conversation. That way we get to know each other a lot better, right? So I'm going to send this as something as a small group exercise that you all can do. But here's some actions for you all to consider. Again, recognize your own implicit bias and remediate your racial literacy. I think that is important to do that self-education. Don't expect only minoritized person in the room, in the department to speak on behalf of their culture or identity group, right? Don't assume to know and understand someone based off of preconceptions and stereotypes. Oftentimes we'll say, I'll hear people say, oh, well, I have a relative that's black or an in-law or whatever. My best friend is black, so now I know everything about all black people, right? Sometimes we have these preconceived notions in our minds because we might know somebody and we think we fully understand when in reality we don't. We might know that person, but not necessarily all the things that come along with their identities. And then seek out learning opportunities to educate yourself about cultures other than your own. I encourage individuals here in the city to go to the African American Heritage Center that's on 18th and Muhammad Ali. There's another place called Roots 101 that's on 4th Street. Lots of education, right? The Speed Museum here in the city does a lot of work around diverse communities and cultures. But it's important to seek out those learning opportunities, not just in the more, reading the book and things of that nature, but actually go and engage in person. Be aware that stereotype threat might be occurring with somebody that you work with, somebody close to you, right? And recognize that, understand that, and do your best to try to counter that. Meaningfully integrate diverse cultures and people into the work that you do in other aspects of your life. Oftentimes, we have a tendency to only be around diverse groups when we're at work or school. But when we go home, our community very much looks just like us, right? Very little diversity in our communities. Again, which is why Louisville is one of the top 5 most segregated cities, because people go right back to communities that look just like them in a lot of different ways, and not even just from a race and ethnicity standpoint, but when you think about income and things like that, it's that way. Responsibly address racism and racial tensions and bias when they arise, and then recognize that you and your colleagues share responsibility, right? We all share responsibility for acknowledging and addressing these inequities that we know are experienced by certain groups within our academic, clinical, and research setting, as well as in the community. I'm guilty of making sure that I speak up and speak out for people who might not have that voice in our community. It's one of the reasons why I serve on a lot of boards. The reality is there's not enough diversity on boards here across the city, right? I'm on Metro Louisville Public Health Board, but until Dr. Ellie Miller from U of L Health came on board, there was little diversity. Even still, over the years, there's been very little diversity. So when we think about our engagement in civically, a lot of places still lack diversity and has to have folks with an equitable lens to speak on behalf of those that might not be at the table or have a voice. Mitigating bias, there's a way for you to do it individually. Catalyst offers this, how to combat unconscious bias as an individual. I have this as a PDF and can share it out along with some other resources I think would be really, really beneficial just to have up at work, sometimes in your workspace to have, just so it's a consistent reminder to things that you can do individually to be unconscious in your thinking or to reduce your unconscious bias. Here's some additional resources that you all can use. Again, I'll share this PowerPoint so that you all can have access to these links. And I also send a ton of other links that you all can use. There are a number of books. I've encouraged departments to think about doing a book study using, one of these books, because it'll allow you to read and think critically, ask questions, and challenge the status quo. I was working with Ron Paul. We started a faculty learning community around diversity and inclusion, and we started with Blind Spot and then moved into Black Men in a White Coat by Dr. Tweedy. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and so we had to put it on pause. I believe we're going to get that back going. But other departments have stepped up and have started to do this same thing, which has been beneficial for the department. The one new book I want to point out is one by Dr. Teresa Reed. Dr. Reed is the dean for the School of Music here at the School of Medicine, and just came out with a book that is titled "You're Likely Not a Racist," and then Answers for Curious White People. So there are a ton of different books out there, videos out there that you can use to educate yourself or just have a useful small conversation. But I encourage you to have something each month that allows you to delve into some topic that span diversity, equity, inclusion. It doesn't have to be racism or implicit bias. There's just a lot of things out there that will allow you to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion in a number of ways. If you're not familiar, Ohio State University has the Kerwin Institute for the study of race and ethnicity. They do a lot of free videos that's available that are quick snippets, and it doesn't cause you to have to sit for long times. So I think it's very wonderful. I'm on the listserv. I review the videos all the time myself. And I believe that's all I have, and I'll entertain questions or an additional conversation. I know we're at the top of the hour. And then I want to remind you of the CME code for those that may have came in after we started.
Thank you, Dr. Compton.
No problem at all.
Robert Friedland, and thank you for your comprehensive and important discussion. I have
no problem at all. Go ahead.
One is, I believe it's important to recognize that biologically there are no human races. The concept of race is an illusion or a delusion. All human groups are mixed. Some are, there are differences, of course, but it's not a biological thing. It's not largely a biological thing. There are no unique groups that are not mixed with other groups. We're all mixed. And I mean, I could go on about this, but it's just a biological truth that genetic studies show we're all the same.
That is very true. Great point. Dr. John Chenault, I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He does a wonderful presentation on that. And one of the things that we often have to do is get people to rethink that particular aspect of race, right? Because there are a lot of people that are still tied to race being biological versus a social construct. So we find ourselves not just with our medical students having these conversations, but believe it or not, there are a lot of people who still feel like race is biological. In our research and our the way we practice medicine hasn't acknowledged that yet. And I know, and I don't mind using personal examples, but dealing with my mom and her having cancer, it just never fails how often her race comes into play versus other family history and things of that nature, right? Race always is centered. And most of the times I'm not dressed up. People don't know I work at the U of L School of Medicine until I start asking certain questions, and they give me kind of a side eye like, okay, you might know a little bit of what you're talking about. But I always ask them, okay, why are y'all adding race here? Why is race being a factor and used the way that it is, right? We know that there's some things that come along with race, discrimination, race, all of that creates stress, et cetera. But to use it as a biological construct is an error. And I think we make a lot of medical misdiagnoses in that manner. So yeah, you're right, Dr. Friedland. Like that's real.
Very good. Thank you. One other question really is, and I don't know where to go with this, but you asked for examples of racism in our community. Mm-hmm. And we're the home of Yum Brands, which is one of the largest producers of junk food or fast food. And this is widely used by minority communities, and
Yep.
it's bad. It's bad for health. Fast food is there are like many reasons why it's not good for us, and I think it's inflicting damage on minority communities. The same thing could be said for Coca-Cola and Pepsi. And
Yes.
I don't know what to do with this as a aspect of racism, but I think it's worth consideration.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I chose the boards that I do serve on, because individually I can advocate and speak out on these topics as you just noted. But then when you're interacting with Louisville Metro Public Health, I mean, that's their focus is public health. We have a Center for Health Equity, and voicing these kind of things with getting those groups that's connected to Metro government to take a stance and and put that out there is important. So that's a way that I try to impart some of that. But you're right. I tell people go past 9th Street and see if you'll find a Rainbow Blossom or a Whole Food or more healthy foods, right? The reality is 90% of my family still lives in West Louisville, and they're going to KFC. They're going to Indies. They're going to fast food restaurants. And the other reality is that when you don't have much income, but McDonald's has a dollar menu and you can feed a family, on that dollar menu, and it's quick and fast, that's what's going to happen. So over time, yeah, you're going to see cardiovascular issues, and things of that nature. We're going to see some serious health implications, but a lot of it also goes back to money and people not wanting to stand up to big companies like Yum. And I always laugh and say Kentucky is we're interesting because all the things is bad for our health, we have them here, right? We're big on bourbon, and too much bourbon over time can hurt. I enjoy bourbon, to be honest, but I mean, too much of it can hurt, right? We have communities that have liquor stores with their branded products on every corner, and then you go in other areas and you'll see the signs saying, "No, we're all going to advocate as a community for no more liquor stores," right? For somebody who's trying to get a new liquor license. And so when we look at how even folks are activated on the ground level and what communities are successful in getting things passed to prevent the negative things from coming into their communities, it is staggering because there are some communities that just, even if they come together collectively, they still don't have a say. Things are still passed, and more liquor stores, more fast food restaurants, things of that nature are placed in their communities versus others. So that's real.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a wonderfully intriguing conversation, and we appreciate your review. We would definitely like to have those resources available so that we can have our smaller groups in our departments and take this to another level. Thank you for stimulating this. No
problem at all. Anytime, and I'll send that to Lilia and Dominique if that's all right.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. And thank you all. And as I said, continue the conversation. Continue to educate yourself, and thanks for all you do for the School of Medicine and for our community.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Compton.
Right. Take care. Thank you.